Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Ambrosetti live webinar. Today, we are going to speak about the future, and it's a real pleasure to have here with us Mr. Gerd Leonhard. He's a futurist. He's connected from Zurich, or from, let me say, the cyberspace, we could say today, and he's an author of a really interesting book about technology versus humanity. It has also an Italian translation available. And is also the CEO of the Future Agency. We are going to spend the next hour and 15 minutes talking about the future. And especially the title of this webinar is The Great Transformation, the key changes for the business today and after the crisis. Our format is our standard one. Mr. Leonhard will spend with us some 30-35 minutes discussing, and with the support of some images and slides and so on. You can submit questions during these 35 minutes, and then during the second part, we are going to answer one by one to the question received. So it's important to outline that this webinar is not only an opportunity to listen, but it's also an opportunity to ask and discuss. That's all for the time being. So, Mr. Leonhard, thanks again for being here with us today. And the speech, the stage, the camera are yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gianluca. Buongiorno, or buonasera, you would say, maybe already, I don't know. But I want to start by saying that, right now is obviously a very difficult time, right? I mean, we are in a serious crisis. There's the crisis before, there's a life before Corona, and then there's a life after Corona. And it's really amazing to see how many things have changed in a very short time. And I really think what's happening is right now that we're rethinking about how we're going to do anything in the future. And it's funny, as a futurist, I always talk about 5 to 7 years from now. But today, everything is about now. Right? It's like the future has arrived very quickly. And another thing that's really interesting when you think about the future is that it's never been less certain than it is now. I mean, the certainty that we had years ago by looking at the future, everything has changed in just 3 or 4 weeks, right? So mind-boggling changes. And I want to start by introducing this saying here by Milton Friedman, right? Only a crisis, whether it's actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis happens, the actions that are taken are depending on the ideas that are lying around. So that's the crisis giving us input for changing and giving us input about what we may do different afterwards. First of all, of course, it's quite clear that this crisis isn't going to end anytime soon. I mean, we can go back to the restaurant, we can maybe go back to the beach a little bit, but are we going to travel in airplanes? Are we going to go to events with 1,000 people? Are we going to go to Thailand for the weekend? It's unlikely, right? It's a total reset. I can tell you from my own experience what is happening right now. This is why I call it the Great Transformation. My work has been to speak in front of many people in like 100 places a year. I took 350 airplane rides in 2019. Right? This year, I'm lucky if I'm going to take 10. Right? So my life has been completely transformed. We have to think of the future in a different way. So I want to use this image here. We tend to look very much at the past, especially here in Europe, Italy and Switzerland, where I live. We have a lot of tradition. We look to the past for our guidance, right? But the reality is, we're going into the future on a jet stream now. And many things that we thought would take longer, they are here now. Bill Gates talked about the pandemic, the virus situation 6 years ago in the TED Talk. And many people talked about it, and it's here now. And we have to understand that we must get better at seeing the future. So no matter whether you're in design or car making or a restaurant or tourism or government, it's very important to understand the future, what I call foresight, right? And get a little bit out of the sort of looking in the mirror about the past. That's one of the key things I think that's keeping us back a lot, right? Let me give you some examples, okay? This situation, right? I mean, the government is telling us what to do now. That would have been unacceptable, any government, the Swiss government, the European government, the American government, the Italian government, telling people when to go out and when to not go out, right? I mean, in a very short time, the government has become a very big authority in our lives. Right? Is that going to change? And which government can we trust? I'll talk more about the trust question. I think this is really what it comes down to. In the last 6 weeks, we have thought very much about who we trust. Each other, the government, our co-workers. Right? This question of trust has emerged as a deep question. And the situation is, clearly, if you're looking at the backdrop of this whole thing happening, right, it's like a giant reset where also some strange things are taking place, like this. Right? There are some habit changes that will go on. Right? This habit probably will not go on, at least I hope not, right? But some habits will go on forever. And if you take a look at this habit, flying, we're not going back to normal. We may eventually go back to flying, but are we going to go back to normal? I think this is the key question we have to ask ourselves, especially in Italy. Are we just going to go back to the normal, or are we going to start again? My view is that going back to normal in many cases will not be possible because the mindset has changed, the financial context has changed. I mean, if you're in business, manufacturing, whatever you do, supply chain, right? We found out supply chain wasn't as safe as it looked. So this is the main theme here for our event today, right? The transformation. Basically, what's happening now is because we are going into the future and looking at this and saying, okay, what parts of our life will continue and which ones will change? You take one example, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Cruise ships, right? Venice, people are going to big places on cruise ships. Very unlikely that this is going to be our future. Right? This part will fall out and other parts will come in. Now, I think for us in business, it's very important to think about which parts of the future can we put in and which ones are less likely to be needed. For example, on top of this, you can see, where is it, right here, right? You can see technology, right? It's all about technology now. And now we have to think about what does it mean for our future? Where are we going with technology? Because as I like to say, this is kind of the new normal, right? We are literally in cyberspace. I mean, all of my speeches are now happening on the internet. You're probably talking to all of your employees constantly on Zoom and whatever other platforms. We're going to have conferences much more on the internet. Will that stop? If we can go back to meeting each other, will we stop doing this? No. I think what's going to happen is right now, 30% of people in Europe are working at home. I think in Italy, that number was 2 or 3% before the crisis. And now we've learned that it's possible. We can work from home. We don't always enjoy working from home, but it's possible. It gives us alternatives. So our mindset has changed. Our habit has changed. So the most important thing about the future, I keep telling people, it's not about tomorrow. The future is not about, Star Trek, what's coming in 50 years. The future is in our heads. The famous science fiction author, William Gibson, he once said that basically the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So we're living in a future that everybody has noticed, but we haven't paid enough attention to it. And I think especially today, it's quite clear, Italy is one of the hardest hit countries in the world in this crisis, not just for the cases, but in so many aspects. And just across from the border from here, when we have to think about how can we go into the future that gives us both kind of the idea of survival and adaptation, but also takes us in a new direction. So I want to skip this one and show you basically what we need to do in regards to taking the next step in this direction. Right? I mean, if you're looking clearly with what's happening in technology, it's a mind-boggling development as far as that is concerned. Talking about survival, right? This is the Microsoft HoloLens. You've probably seen it before. And this is a demo, and I think this is going to become reality now, of where a person can be projected as a keynote speaker here, right? This woman is speaking, and basically can be projected into the room. So in the future, I'm going to go to the airport. I'm going to go into this room, which costs about $1 million right now. and I'm going to virtually appear somewhere else. Right? And if you see the demo on YouTube, it's Microsoft HoloLens, Japanese. So when she takes out the holographic projection, and this has already worked years ago, but it's finally actually happening, and the person that's there speaks Japanese. Will this become our future? Well, I hope it will become our future in so many ways for meetings. It will never substitute ourselves, going to actual places, meeting people. That won't ever happen, but clearly we can see most of what we're doing is moving here to the cloud. And I can guarantee you, the more we move stuff to the cloud, our music, our films, our television, our books, our library, our banking, right? The more we move things to the cloud, the more we want to actually meet with people. Let's not forget, the most important thing for humans is not technology, it's not just making it happen like this. The most important thing for humans is experiences, engagement, and experiences and relationships. Being able to relate to each other, trust each other, those are things that make us human. I think very important, if we think about restarting our business during and after the crisis, technology will be the great helper, but the mix of what makes us human and how people trust us is kind of how we go forward. When you look at the sort of promotion of technology, it's really interesting to see in the last couple of weeks, people have gone from using Zoom, from 20 million to 300 million and 50 other platforms. Right? I think this is going to stay, but it's just kind of a simulation of how we are in real life. We shouldn't confuse that with our real contact. For example, on the issue of trust I talked about earlier, trust isn't digital. Trust cannot be downloaded. Your customers won't trust you just because you have an app. Right? This is about relationships. And I think these technologies will help us build relationships, but they're really just tools. They're kind of showing us a future that is possible. Right? So many people that think that technology is kind of like this magic tool that changes our entire world, but the reality is that this here, sorry, I'm confusing the mirror here, right? The importance of having the human contact, that's really our future. And I think it's important for us to understand when we build a business, how much emphasis do we put on the tools or we put on the relationships. And clearly, this is going to be even more important when we go into this future, right? Technology will now become kind of smart, right? Artificial intelligence. And clearly, this is interesting because a common confusion, when we talk about human intelligence, right? This is the kind of intelligence that we have: social, intellectual, emotional. It's not at all like a machine. So I think when we look in the future, we were saying, okay, we're going to bring in those machines. Right now, a self-driving car, if it can actually drive itself, is not intelligent like a human. It's basically an intelligent assistant. Very important point, I think, for us to remember. We are human. We are actually not machines, I don't think. Right? So we should sometimes put technology in its place and make sure we're still doing the things that we can do the best. Let me show you some graphs on this. Just real simple, you'll see here the sort of forecast of how much data is going to come into our world. And now you're seeing a forecast what kind of jobs will go away because of artificial intelligence. And it's quite clear the jobs that are routine, transportation, storage, manufacturing, many of those jobs are not total routine, but many of those are routine jobs and commodity jobs, as people say. They will be done by machines. And the jobs that are not routine, right, health, scientific, technical, understanding, we'll show up again in a second, that we can say, well, that's clearly going to be the jobs of the future. Let's keep in mind, there's a balance between those two and a shift. About 100 years ago, 85% of Europeans, parentheses, worked in agriculture. And today that's less than 2%, but we're not all unemployed. This is a shift that we're seeing. We have to use technology to make things better for us and then improve what we can do as people. Right? I think clearly when we look at technology like this, right now technology is the winner. Right? I mean, in this crisis, if you don't have internet, you don't have a camera, you don't have a mobile phone, you are in deep trouble. And that's going to grow technology to be even more like our relationships are embedded online and social networks and so on. Right? Technology is exploding. We have to be very careful to put technology in its place, like this graph shows. It's important to connect, and sometimes it's important to disconnect. I mean, happiness is not a download, right? Relationships aren't just consumed like this. And I think it's also very important to think about things like surveillance. I think it's okay if the government uses data from us right now to track us and to do tracing and to help us find the right connections and so on. But afterwards, we should go back to a certain amount of freedom and liberty in terms of the mix. Another sector that's going to do great is healthcare. I mean, clearly, the chase for the vaccine, right, and of course also the treatment, right, of the current COVID crisis. That's going to be a big deal. But not just that. I mean, everything around healthcare is set to explode. You want to invest in the future, healthcare, biotechnology, digital assistance, that is exploding. I foresee literally trillions of euros flowing into the healthcare sector on the public side and on the investment side, probably coming out of the oil industry, which I'll talk about shortly, why that's not going to go anywhere. Lots of Italian companies are, of course, in that turf on the diagnostics and all these kind of things. And the future of pharma, clearly is the convergence of technology and biology. And that's clearly a huge opportunity, I think, also where we can think about how that will be done in our social system and who's going to pay for what and all these kind of things. I also see positive things for food. In our future, we're going to start looking to create food differently, like vertical farming, food that's done in the lab. You heard about artificial meat, I'm sure. I tried it. It doesn't taste as bad as it sounds. And protein substitutes and so on. I think our entire food cycle is now going to be questioned also because of COVID and the corona crisis. People are wondering, can we be self-sufficient? Where does the food come from? The water. So that's going to be a great boon there. Clearly, I think we're going to invest a lot of money there in next generation food and agriculture. That also has to do, of course, with climate change, which I'll talk about shortly. One word about manufacturing and factories and design and production and so on. Clearly, we're going to see what I call the game changers in my book. That is chapter 6, along with the mega shifts. That's chapter 3. That's, by the way, a free download. You'll get the link later. And what's happening here is that we're not just anymore in the 4th industrial revolution, as various people have talked about over the years, right? We're actually moving to the 5th industrial revolution, right? And that's artificial intelligence. It's basically moving into a world where technology can take over for us and do the routine jobs. We can see that happening right now. Automation clearly is a key factor also in creating new opportunities. For example, Amazon is the king of automation, but last year it hired 240,000 people in 1 year. So I think that's a bit of a challenge to jobs, because the more we automate, the more we have to move up the food chain. And that's clearly going to be a challenge for us, but I would not be that worried that there are new jobs. All you have to do is look backwards and say, well, 10 years ago, we didn't have social media. We didn't have social media communication. Today, every company has people working in social media. In fact, there's 21 million people are working in social media. Jobs didn't exist 10 years ago. Will there be new jobs because of the game changes in artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things? Absolutely. Do we know what they are? Not really. That's a bit scary. We have to prepare for different skills and think about those directions, right? So supply chain, really a quick comment on this. Now we have this huge debate about supply chain, whether we need to diversify supply chain. Some people are saying globalization has been a bad thing. I think globalization is here to stay. These issues are global. They're going to remain global. We're going to parallelize supply chain. We're going to use more technology to make it safer. We quickly have learned the lesson in supply chain in the last 3 months. But it's surprising to see how well it has actually worked compared to the worst cases. So it's to me, I think that's a topic we're clearly struggling with, the issue of globalization also, because of course the initial impulse is when something goes wrong is to protect ourselves more. I think that will probably not work in the long run, because issues like water, food, cyber warfare, genetic engineering, those are issues that are global issues where we have to collaborate. So that brings me to the key point of my speech. I have a few other key points, but here's an Italian company called Avio, and they have invented a new airplane seat. Well, the seat goes with the plexiglass thing. It seems like if you're in the business of plexiglass these days, you probably come out ahead, no matter how you look at it. But now people are thinking about how we're going to fly in an airplane and keep the distance, right? So there's a whole draft of things that just came out about how companies are doing this. There's 4 points I want to say about our immediate future, the next year, say maybe 2 years. Right? First, survival. I think right now it's about survival. It's about getting all the support you can, about collaborating, about being kind to your staff, to your team members, right, to everybody, to your clients. And there's companies that haven't been kind. I'll talk about that shortly. And everybody's going to look back at this time and they're going to say, have you done the right thing during the war? You know, just the COVID war, you could say. Right? So very important, survival, and then adaptation. You know, finding new ways to go forward. And it's going to be basically every day there'll be another adaptation challenge. I am the first one to adapt, you know, moving from the big stage to online. And you know, it's not perfect, but I'm getting there. And the third one is collaboration. I mean, it's not going to be anymore about competition. So one thing I can tell you right now, I can see in my sector here in Switzerland, there's so many more companies collaborating that used to be competitors. And that's how we can get to a new place to reinvent quickly together. And the last point leads to the transformation. So print this out, right? Survival, making sure that things are still going to go forward. Adaptation, collaboration, transformation. I saw a great manifesto yesterday from the designers in Milano. I think it was called the Digital Design Manifesto, about how to relaunch when the lockup is over, going exactly in this direction. We have to think a little bit differently now. We can't just go back to the old. We're in fact not going back to the old. Here's a great example of why we're not going back to the old. This is a test, antibody test, imaginary, of course, that we may have to take if we're going to travel internationally in the near future. You know, imagine, I mean, if we're going to get a vaccine in a year, maybe sooner, but it doesn't look like it. A year from now, people are going to ask, you know, if you want to travel to America or to New Zealand or wherever you want to travel, you're going to need those kind of tests. Imagine what that will do to travel. Imagine what kind of new opportunities will open up. But if you're an airline right now, yeah, that really makes you think. And that's one of the businesses where I say, well, I think Lufthansa announced yesterday, or now it was Swiss, saying that it's going to be 2022 until it's back to normal for intercontinental traveling. One thing that is, I think, long overdue is that we're probably going to have to do without the cruise ships. Because, you know, who's going to voluntarily go back on a cruise ship with another 1,500 people? I mean, I may be wrong there because maybe people overcome it quickly, especially Americans maybe. But I think this is one business where we can safely say that is difficult on so many levels, and this may be the end of it. So maybe we can discuss later what you think of what the impact of that is. But I think it's primarily a good thing if we can build an industry that is not based on the local exploitation like this. So bottom line is this, right? We're going to a new program. It's time to switch on the new program. Part of the old stations are shut down. You know, the way that we used to do things. You know, business as usual. We're going to have business as usual. I think business will be unusual pretty much all the way around. And if we're lucky, we'll discover some things that go back. I think we'll go back to restaurants, not like we used to. We'll go back to flying or driving a car or meeting, but with social distance, and then maybe a second wave. Right? We have to be prepared to switch to new channels. Let me address one really important issue, and that is tourism. You know where this is, of course. Right? My favorite street in Milano. All the great restaurants are no longer active at the time. I think this week is the reopening, right, for some of them. Clearly, tourism is in for a huge challenge. There are good things here, however. You see on this chart here, sorry, I keep confusing the sites, right? We have local people traveling, not just Italians, but also Swiss and Germans to each other sooner or later, once we can do that again. International travel, I think that will be difficult, and this is a tough one for Italy. Italy obviously has a huge chunk of international travelers, and it's going to be more local. I think the good thing about travel and tourism in the near future is local tourism, different kind of tourism, sustainable tourism, maybe not the mass approach anymore, maybe a slightly different approach, but definitely survival, adaptation, collaboration, transformation. That's definitely a challenge, but I think not a challenge that we can't overcome. Clearly, if we're going to see this in the future, I've did a little bit of research on the plexiglass thing, which now there's people proposing to put it on the beach in Rimini. I hope you don't go there to try this out. It seems unlikely to be such a nice thing to do on the beach. And of course, the restaurants. You've seen this just made the rounds in Italy a couple of days ago, right, to where people are putting out plexiglass. But this is adaptation. Think of it in a mental way. Maybe you have to put up some mental plexiglass, to start business again in a new way. So that wraps up this part of the presentation. Now I want to talk a little bit about climate change. Okay, I know this is a bit of a topic that seems to have lost momentum compared to COVID, but basically what we're seeing here, and I think this is not all bad news, I'll explain in a second why. The effects of climate change and global warming are going to be 1,000 times of what we see in COVID in terms of the impact on our lives. It's just that there are 10, 20, 30, 50 years away. The United Nations Climate Change Panel says it'll be roughly 50 years until we may have an increase of over 4% of warming, 300 million climate refugees in Europe. We have to act on this, and I think it brings up great opportunity to think about if we can do this that we're doing right now to fight an immediate threat, what could we be doing when it's about fighting a larger threat, climate change? Are we willing to pay a carbon tax? Are we rethinking of how we travel? This is a great opportunity. I think many people are thinking that the corona crisis is a bit of a test. But I can tell you right now, I think Italian companies have led the way there in many ways. If you're not sustainable in the near future, people will not look at you. Sustainable in the larger sense, not just in terms of resources, right, or fossil fuels, but generally, right, what's called the circular economy. That's clearly coming. I think we can also safely say, if you're in the oil business, right, the end of oil is near. I know I've said that for 10 years, but it's finally becoming true. The oil economy is something that kind of belongs in the past. And we see oil and gas companies and coal companies as burning platforms. Worldwide, we still have 80% of the energy is done by fossil fuel, but this is a huge opportunity also because, the oil business employs 10 million people. The sustainable industry, I think, could employ 100 million people. And if you look at what's happening in the stock market, I mean, if you put money in Aramco right now, will it go back up? Yes, but is it a business I think will go in the future? The end of oil is near. That's something to keep in mind because it also brings, again, vast new opportunities in renewable energy and other things like nuclear fusion and things. So again, here we have to expect this. I think not this year, obviously, because of the current situation, maybe not next year, but it will happen probably in a year or two, is that everything that we know will be subject to carbon tax. Not just manufacturing and what we do in our production cycles, but meat, right? Agriculture, airlines paying a carbon tax on each ticket, ships, transportation, container shipping. Right? That should unlock a huge amount of money for doing new things. And I see a great paradox here, of course, because on the one hand, nobody wants to pay an extra tax, right? But on the other hand, maybe this is something that we can learn about the future. That brings me to one of my final points, and that is government. Right now, we're living in the time of big state. The state is now basically in every country, the state has taken over so many things that, like in Switzerland, you can say, well, we basically have a basic income now. Everybody's getting paid for doing something or the other. And I know we're lucky there compared to other countries, right? But from New Zealand to Iceland, right, all over the world, we're seeing the state grow in importance. And this is why it's so important that we trust the state, that we figure out how they can be made trustworthy, that they understand the future. Of course, this is a huge topic in Italy. I'm not going to put my hand into a minefield here. But clearly, this is also a huge discussion that goes with the next one, which is Europe, right? Here's the bottom line on Europe and the Euro bonds, the Corona bonds. I think this is a make it or break it moment for Europe. Either we can exist in solidarity, egged on by the virus, or we cannot. And in my view, it has to be unlimited solidarity, north, south, east, west, to come out of this as what's called the United States of Europe. I know it sounds crazy, to talk about that. Now, I read yesterday, and I live in Switzerland, but I'm German originally. Some research showing that 46% of Italians are now distrusting Germany for what happened, or Germans, for what happened. I hope that's not true for me, for what happened during the crisis. I can understand that, but I think we're looking at a future where we have to solve these issues together. And I think that's the story of Europe. I have great confidence that the Commission and the Parliament will make the right steps, but this is definitely a tough place because, this is our future. We're going to live in a global society where it's important that we collaborate on water, food, science, security, safety, and of course, everything else that matters to us and everything else that we can only achieve together. Look at this graph here, the expected debt of Italy after the public spending now. Clearly, that is a situation that needs to be tackled on a pan-European level. That's my opinion. And I would love to hear your feedback on this. So I'm going to wrap up and say, what does it mean for us personally? There's a trust crisis, right? We found out that we can trust some people, and we found out we cannot trust other people. And this is a really big point. I think the most important thing in business, the most important currency is trust. I love this picture because this is what your customers want to feel like. You're going to catch them when their going gets hard. I'm going to trust you to fly up in the air and not crash on the ground. And clearly there are companies who have not done that, and they will be looked down upon after the crisis is over. I think in so many ways, trust is the most important thing you can show to your customers and your co-workers. And that goes with kindness. We have learned unexpected acts of solidarity around the world, from the singing to the sharing to the spontaneous thing. And that makes me believe that ultimately humans are good, parenthesis. Hopefully you would agree on this. Right? So on this trust level, just as one example, you've seen the sign. It's made the rounds in the media in Italy, everywhere, right? If you can give, please do. If you can't, then take something. I mean, this is a pretty amazing point that could lead as the guideline to our future. Right? And that leads also to be the guideline for Europe and the guideline for our businesses. That's how we can sustain. In contrast, Airbnb, for example, has proven that they've had all these conflicts now in the last couple of weeks that will not refund people for trips on an appropriate level. Even I, on my own level, have Airbnb refuse refunds and take the commission on trips that didn't happen. When you do those kind of things, you don't recover. And I think it's really clear. This should be a motto of how we do our business, right? Chi più ammetta, chi non più apprenda, if I can say that. So to wrap this up, this future, right, staying among ourselves, wrapping up our own business in such a way won't work. This is our new future, right? We are interconnected, collaborating, helping each other, starting new ideas by thinking out of the box. Clearly, that's where things are going. I use this symbol that I have in many of my films. I'm going back to what I said earlier. Right? It's about hyper collaboration. This is how we're going to get through this crisis. Figuring out new ideas, adapting, collaborating, and then coming up with new ideas, new business models. Like this very thing here that we're doing today is a new business model. Are we only going to meet online? Of course not. But are we going to continue meeting online? Yes. This is a new business. I always said digital conferencing is the future. And the more I do this, the more I want to come and meet you. And I think, given that Milan is not that far away, hopefully I'll be able to do that. So I wrap up by this, essentially saying it's so important that we don't look at the future as a black hole. We have to understand what's coming. We have to have foresight. And we're talking about, next 2 or 3 or 5 years, not 50 years. And this is not about prediction. It's about getting a good feel for what's coming. No matter what business you're in, now you have to have a good idea of what's coming and what is possible, and not going back to what it used to be, but adapting, coming up with new things. So thanks for your time and your attention. I'm happy to take some questions now, or maybe shed light on some important points. I know this was a lot of details, so I thank you very much for holding on and for listening to me today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leonhard, for all the contents that you have shared with us in during this, let me say, 35 minutes. Now we are going to start with the second part of the webinar, and we are going to answer to the question we have received. I remind to all participants that they can use the chat to submit questions. It's preferable that you submit question in English, but if you send us question in Italian, let me say our internal staff will translate it real time into English for the benefit of Mr. Gerd Leonhard. And I will start with summing up a couple of questions that cover, let me say, more or less the same topic. And this topic is the future of smart working and the future of headquarters. I'm going to read the two questions to you. The first of the two questions is the following. Within the more advanced countries in terms of smart working, what's the balance between days at home and days at work? Are there any possible regulation or exception for this balance? What are the real limits of a widely spread smart working? For sure, let me say, this period has stressed the way we work. But along with this question, I kindly ask you also to consider this one that is, let me say, strictly related. What's the future of big corporations, big headquarters, which means big spaces? This crisis has shown us that not all, but a significant part of people do not need to go to the office. But what about interactions and relations creating new ideas? Those are the two, let me say, preliminary questions.
Yes, I published a movie in January called How the Future Works, and that talks exactly about these kind of things. It's how the future works.tv. But let me answer briefly. Basically, what we see today, Peter Drucker said something similar. I don't quite remember what it is, but I always say that culture eats technology for breakfast. Culture is what defines everything. And culture is so different in different countries. If you're looking just the difference between Switzerland and, say, Italy or Spain or Portugal, right? It seems a little bit the same, but it's really vastly different. And when we talk about the working culture, the idea of people working from here, working remotely, that's quite common in South Korea and Japan. Americans do that a lot. In Europe, yeah, we're very much reluctant to give up the personal meeting, right? But I think what's happening right now is that we can safely say that as we are trying out new things, we find out this is actually a good thing. Maybe we only just go to the office for 2 days, and that's going to change the entire city, right? So here's the bottom line is rental property will go down in most cities, but there will, of course, be other people renting. But big company headquarters, yeah, that's going to be a big question mark. Shared working, that's already been going up. That's going to go up more. Right? Of course, what you do at home is always subject to your infrastructure at home. You live in a household with 7 people, in a full house, it's much more difficult to get away. And that's, of course, in Italy, we have many families living together, right? So it's much harder to work like this than here at home in Switzerland, where I have my office. I can do what I want. But I think ultimately we are learning that, it's nice to meet, but we don't always have to meet. And it's a good substitute. I can meet with my team members like this, and we don't have to travel. We travel for the important things. So does it mean it becomes less important to be there as a person? I don't think so. But I think we're going to be more critical and ask a question, do I really have to go to Beijing for 1 day for a meeting? Right? And we're going to have better technology. I mean, we're going to see billions of euros flow into augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, that's Microsoft, holograms, right? All that stuff. And I think those are great tools. It's a little bit like, I always say, it's like dating, right? You can do dating on the internet or use Tinder or whatever you use. I don't use that, but maybe some people do. Or you can date as a person. It's just different. It's not necessarily worse or bad. So I think the future of work will be mixed. We're going to get used to working in so many different ways, right? What I call a mixed workforce. So outsiders, insiders, temporary people, virtual people. I think the estimate is roughly in less than 10 years, 50% of employees will not be employees. Right? They're going to contribute in one way or the other on demand, like we have now. And for that, we need a new social structure, right? We cannot have people working part-time or as freelancers and then not get covered by insurance and those like what's happening with the TaskRabbit or Airbnb and so on. So the future of work, I think, is good news. We can work from anywhere. Bad news is we're not used to it. So we need to figure out how this goes forward. Now it's a good time to practice because these tools are extremely powerful. They're also, if you live in Sicily on a small island and you have internet, you can work. Right? I mean, you don't have to live in the city to work. And I think that is a great plus for so many people.
Thank you. You mentioned during your presentation, during your speech, the importance and the key role of new technologies. And the next question is about 5G. The question is the following: will the technological advancement lead to a 5G boost? And so could you spend a few words more specifically about 5G today, 5G for the future, example of applications you believe will transform the way we live and we work?
Well, it's quite clear technology is the winner in everything right now because technology is the ticket. If you don't have internet, you can't work remotely. If you don't have a camera, you can't do this. And the story goes on. So people are buying technology, they're buying green screens, they're buying computers, and 5G, is clearly going to be hypercharged in this whole discussion because 5G allows no latency. So I can do a real-time hologram from top of Vesuvio if I want to, right? Using 5G. And I think that's an extremely powerful application that's going to revolutionize how we do pretty much anything. Payment, telepresence, you can be a doctor operating over 5G with a patient that's 1,000 kilometers away. Right? And those will be fantastic things. There's also a drawback in that we are getting over technology exposed, right? So we're becoming dependent on it. We're basically preferring the augmented reality to our real reality. We get confused, right? We keep forgetting who we are. So the way I look at it, first, I think 5G is a very welcome innovation, and then we need to see how we can use it for human purposes, not just for financial purposes, right? And we also put a limit. Like, 5G should not mean that every camera in every city on every corner is connected to every data collection agency in the world, and this is a little bit my worry, is that we have too much technology. So I always say too much of a good thing is a very bad thing. Right? And this is the same story whether you talk about cake or drugs or alcohol or whatever, right? You have too much, it's not good, right? And I think 5G should be welcomed and is a great force for good, but we do have to come up also with rules. For example, health rules also, right? And people are concerned about those kind of things. So it's not just like, anything goes. We have to think a little bit about the context.
Okay. We are receiving several questions. Some of them are, let me say, broad and general. Some of them are more specific, talking about specific sectors, industries. And this is the case of the next one. The question is, which will be the future of postal services? Because among our participants, we have a representative of many different companies covering all the sectors, all the industries, and this person comes from one of the, let me say, major company or the major company in Italy working in the postal service. And the question to you, let me ask you, is not only, let me say, your forecast about the postal service, but also the future is, how do you think when you have to think about the future? What do you analyze in order to help those people to, let me say, to create their own methodology, to where to look in order to find their answer?
Yeah, let me answer the second question first. So first of all, understanding the future is not really a science, at least not for me. I think there's lots of science pieces that are part of it, if you're a scientist, right? But this is more like art, right? So imagine, when you speak to Jeff Bezos, from Amazon, he talked for a long time about how every decision that he makes, he does focus group and research and data, and every decision, he says only God can come without data, is what he said, right? So data is so important, right? And then he says 6 months ago that every important decision about Amazon and his life is based on intuition, understanding, imagination, right? This is complete opposite, right? So the reality is, I think for us to understand things, it's not such a question of just having the facts. There's no such thing. So I think if you have kids, you know what I'm saying, right? You can look at the facts about your kids, but understanding your kids, that's completely different, right? It's understanding your kids is the facts are like this, and understanding is like this, right? So basically, what you do about the future, you look at a lot of different things, and then you develop an intuition, in English called a hunch, I just know where to. So in 1999, I said that music will no longer be on plastic; it will move to the cloud. Right? That was 1999, and then we had Napster, and then I started a company like Spotify myself. It didn't work, but then today, what do we have today? No more plastic. The music is up there, right? So if you can develop hunches, this is crucial, especially if you're in design, if you're in services like consulting, right? It's all about hunches, imagination, intuition, and then the facts on top, like the magic cream, right? But if you can't tell me what your imagination is about your work in 7 years, you are in deep trouble, right? Because this is what it will take for us. Like, if you're in the car business, I'll tell you a funny story. 7 years ago, we met with some of the executives of one of the biggest German car companies, the biggest. And we met 100 of their top people 7 years ago. And we talked about electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, car sharing, right? And everybody in the room was laughing, right? They're like, no, nobody wants to share the car. Electric cars are terrible. Autonomous cars, that's science fiction, right? Today, the very same companies have to fire people every 2 weeks because the diesel engine is finished, right? They're going to stop making diesel engines. And Mercedes-Benz just announced that everybody gets fired that worked on the diesel engine, right? If they had understood 7 years ago what the future is, would have been so much better, right? So again, so what you do with this, you read, I read 4 or 5 books a month. I do a lot of conversation. I watch a lot of very interesting videos. I talk to many people. So you have to develop a future mindset, okay? If you're Ferrari or Lamborghini or the local area around, what is the future of the luxury car? I think it's completely different than the future of the car. It's a whole different story. Right? You have to develop a feel for that. So let me go back to the Postal Service, okay? One thing is really quite clear. Anything that can be sent digitally and legally will sooner or later be sent digitally. And that is a job for the Postal Service also, I think, because it's about certification. Here in Switzerland, the postal office is also giving you a postal ID, secure ID, which is a Postal Service job, right? Will there be less people? Well, in the future, e-commerce is big, so we have more deliveries, right? That has been true for now. But in the near future, we're going to print our products in 3D printing. So I will go downtown to the printing center in Milano, and I can print my shoes. Right? But that's already working. It's just not very pretty. But I think the postal services have to branch out into the digital world, just like music went from records to the digital world, right? And build a new service system. Right? So one of the key things about that I didn't get to touch on earlier is that we need to see if we can expand the way that we look at the future in a wider sense, right? And look at business models where we are not always doing the same thing, right? So right now it's forcing us to say, well, if my restaurant can't be open with so many people, can I add something else and have a different business model? Here in Zurich, we have many restaurants that were becoming a master in delivery, right? and Italian food a lot, right? And you would order there because 5 minutes after cooking, it's here, right? And so you can reinvent, you can do new things, but clearly, yeah, that's a challenge. To make a long story short, the future is not a science to me, it's an art. And science and art can certainly come together there, but understanding, imagination, intuition, that's important.
Thank you very much. Now, a couple of questions coming from Chairman and CEO. So they are, let me say, quite broad question. The first one is really interesting because it looks at the past to ask you a question about the future. And the question is the following, about trust and cooperation. Mm-hmm. The Second World War was a huge shock and started the beginning of a new world order. This moment gave birth a multilateral world and ignited the European integration. Without this, Europe risk will be lost in the competing geopolitical competing powers. Can the Corona drama moment trigger a similar renovation given the Calvinistic North, between the Calvinistic North and the Catholic South?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, basically, how do humans change? How do companies change? How do countries change? There's only two ways that we change. That's pain or love, right? This is the human factor. We don't change if there's no reason. Right now, we have so many reasons to change. The list goes out the door, right? So today, this is the opportunity for us to say, you know what? This used to be true. Like, the Germans are worried about the money that they gave to Greece and all that whole story. That's used to be true. It's no longer true. Right now, it's only about one thing, right? Can we help each other to build something new at pretty much any circumstance? Or are we going to crash in the process of keeping things to ourselves? And, the Germans paid the solidarity tax when East Germany came back, the DDR, the GDR, came back to West Germany. Every West German had to pay a tax, right? They had to pay a solidarity tax. And I think what's going to happen now is like everybody has to pay a solidarity tax for the countries that are having financial issues. And of course, in Switzerland, we're not part of the European Union, but I am German, so I'm still part of that process, right? But I think it's really quite clear that this is the key to our future. There's a time before COVID, there's a time after COVID, and now we're ready to make a jump. We're ready to make a jump in climate policy. We're ready to make a jump in so many issues. We're also making a jump towards strong government, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of things where we have to ask ourselves only one question. Can we get out of this in a good way together, or are we going to stuck in a bad way individually? Right? It cannot be good for the rich South to have, for the rich North, to have a South that's falling apart financially. That cannot be good. Right? So my view is that this is a realization that we're going to see, and I'm very much looking forward to the revised decision about the Eurobonds or similar measures in that regard. I think this is really a question of solidarity. In the future, America is becoming less important in general terms, clearly also because of how they treated this crisis. China is rising in importance. If Europe wants to be its own power, we can only do it together. That's why I've been talking about the concept of the United States of Europe for quite some time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leonhard. Next question is about, let me say, emerging countries, or better, the third world. And the question is, when we think about the future, we always think about our Western societies. But how will the third world evolve?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, there's no longer such a thing as developing countries. It's not like 20 years ago when we looked at Nigeria or Indonesia, and they were like developing like out there somewhere, right? They have their own way of doing things. They have their own adaptation modes, that they do things on their own pace. And in many ways, it's like, I think what we're seeing here is like the differences are not that easy to identify anymore. And it's to me, it's quite clear that ultimately, when we go on the global agenda about water, food, artificial intelligence, science, security or so, then these countries will be the big players. I mean, it's quite clear that's already true for China, right? Economic growth, we're going to see, like we have already mostly in those countries. The bad thing about the COVID crisis, the corona crisis, that it's always hitting those that already have the most problems. And this is clearly in every country, it's the same story. Like I get impacted by this, but I had 10 great years as a speaker, so I can wait, But in other countries, most of the poor people, like 35 million people in Brazil, are starving. Right? And so I think those are becoming very, very big issues. Again, to me, ultimately, it's the question of first Europe and then a global solidarity to solve those problems together. For example, giving countries a free license for smart cities, giving them new means for power plants, helping them with new kinds of energy. I mean, I think ultimately, I think the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the other day, the way forward is not with a dysfunctional way of staying separate, but with a functional way of helping each other to create something together that we can all enjoy. And that's, of course, the motto of the UN, period. But I think therein lies the challenge for us. First, the region, then the country, then Europe, then the world, right? This is kind of, I think that's the agenda.
Now, back to a question about, let me say, specific sector or industry. And more specifically, the question is about the healthcare sector. In a panorama full of high-speed changes, where the only certainty left seemed to be that certainties have ended up, how digitization will be applied in the healthcare sector? This is a broad question, obviously. So I kindly ask you to focus to one or two specific example, really interesting example we should look at in the future to, let me say, intercept the great revolution and great transformation in the healthcare sector.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite clear when we look at the current scenario is that the future of healthcare is technology, right? I mean, biology and technology are converging. So in 5 years, we will not be taking a pill for blood pressure, right? We have technological means of addressing the issue of preventing blood pressure, right? So I'll give you a simple example. I mean, in my view, it's completely certain that Apple will come up with a medical device that will not be a phone. It will just be a completely freestanding medical device for telemedicine, right? And then can we prevent things? Yes. Can we help each other? Can we exchange information? Right? Can we alarm each other? So technology and biology are converging. And that creates all kinds of opportunity. Ultimately, the goal is to bring the costs of healthcare down by 80, 90%. Right? And this is a global problem. Right? So imagine if you had a device or whatever that was connecting you to the cloud, the healthcare cloud, and 80% of the visits of the doctor would be unneeded because you are constantly connected and exchanging data. You would only do that if the data was safe, right? If it can be trusted, if there's a public entity or a global entity basically giving you a trust ID, right? And this is what's happening right now. So I basically, at the pharma companies, they're on the last window of selling medication. Right? Everything is becoming technology. And then this whole issue of living longer. I mean, we're living longer every year. We're living 3 months longer. Longevity is here. My kids, the kids of my kids, will live to be an average of 100 years old. So just as an example, in so many ways, healthcare is the place to be right now, especially because of this crisis. This is not the last pandemic. Right? It's not the end of the pandemic. This is something that we constantly have to address. And also one thing to remember is this has been a very terrible thing, especially in Italy, with so many people dead and infected. But compared to the previous crises that we've had with viruses, H1N1, and of course before that, right? We're talking about hundreds of millions before that, and literally tens of millions. So we have already in many ways upgraded our performance here. But the final word on this, I think the governments will spend so much more money on public health care to prevent exactly this, in the future so that we are ready. Right? And the readiness is going to cost a lot of money. There'll be more jobs, there'll be more technology, great sector to invest.
Thank you. I really like the next question. It is about the Easter Island. The question is the following. You are very positive, but what do you think about what happened on Easter Island, for example? They have not been able to start over from the change. The change was for them the beginning of the end. Are we so sure that mankind is capable of not repeating that experience?
That is entirely possible. I mean, as I said in the beginning, the future is less certain than it has ever been right now. You know, if you just go back a year, who would have said that the government can dictate our terms and tell us what to do? And now we're just used to it. So I think that it is extremely difficult to give precise sort of foresights on this. There's only a question of what you believe to be true, right? And here's the key question. Do you believe that people, humans, in principle, are capable of good things, or are they mostly going to do bad things? Right? So in other words, this philosophical question really fits in well with Italy, right? Leonardo da Vinci, and before that, the whole discussion about what is the Vitruvian man, right? How do we connect with everything around us? Are we essentially good or bad? Right? I think we essentially have good things in us. Bad things can come out, but I trust that we can find solutions. You can already see that happening right now. The way that people are reacting to this crisis and reinventing. Is it painful? Yes, absolutely. Is the pain sometimes a good catalyst? Absolutely. So I don't know about Easter Island, but there's a case for every argument here. Some people are saying that in the crisis, an autocrat and a strong person is the winner. And I would say in the crisis like this, the strong people that we know have been losers, right? And they have not performed well. The 37-year-old woman, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, she has been a winner, right? Not the guy across the Atlantic who seems to be losing everything. So,
two more broad questions about the future of agriculture and the future of cities. So let's start with the first one. Which are, in your opinion, the main drivers that will lead the future of agriculture? And he's a managing director of a company.
Well, again, technology, right? We are finally able to say, well, vertical farming, like having a farm in a high rise, it's too expensive now. It's very expensive, right? But we have the first demos in countries that are really hot, right? That this is possible if we bring the price down from being 10x, it could eventually, one building could feed 100,000 people, right? And this is not that far away. And at the same time, we're also going back to the country, back to organic farming at the same time. So there's room for both. And technology is going to make it possible. Robotic farming, right? And for example, artificial meat made in the lab. Bill Gates is an investor. Richard Branson is an investor. Right now, it's 2,000 euros a pound, okay, for the meat from the lab, which is real meat, not fake. It's grown from an actual cow, right? In 10 years, Bill Gates says this meat will be 1/10 of the price of other meat, normal meat. And so if you want to eat burgers and sausages the whole day, you can, right? How are we going to feed the world? Technology, change of habits. Right? I mean, clearly, I'm not vegetarian. I prefer not to eat too much meat, but I think we're moving towards a vegetarian world. And I'm dead certain, for example, already started in Holland half a year ago, that the government told the farmers they can produce less cows, less pigs, because of climate change. Agriculture is 28% of global pollution. 28, right? I think it's the number one factor, pretty much. Right? So do we have to? Yes, we have to look at this. And I think there's many opportunities here. How we field the world, genetic engineering, technology being used here, but also the organic way of farming is coming back in so many ways, like wine. Red wine is now basically, finally, you can drink organic red wine, right? I think there's many new opportunities here. Having said that, we're going to have to change our habits as to how we eat and what we eat. And this is a very, very big topic. But now that we had to stay at home, and we're thinking about our eating habits more. So that's also a change there.
Okay. And next question is about the future of cities. What will our cities look like in the next decades? Will we still live in the age of urbanization, even if we won't need to be physically close to work and opportunities? Because in fact, this period of coronavirus has shown us that it is not necessary to work in big quarter to get all the services and so on, but we can work remotely, which means that we can live remotely. So does this experience of coronavirus will change the trend of urbanization in your point of view?
Yes, well, I mean, this is right now. This is a total reset, right? Let's just keep in mind what is going to be the same, and that's the way that humans are, right? Humans care about relationships, engagement between people, experiences. We don't care much about data. We care a little bit about money, but everything else is subject to those three things, right? And what we really care about is each other. And I think what cities did originally, that we went there to be with each other. And then they became industrial centers and high rises. And, you know, I think we're going to go back in cities where we will, for the first time ever, we may see a decline in rent prices in cities, right? And then the car is going to go, right? The cities will kick out the cars. And when the cars go, the parking garages go, right? And what do we put there? Maybe childcare center, you know, maybe a virtual reality meeting place, I don't know. But the cities are going to change very quickly. Now in Italy, this is a very particular topic because of the age of most cities, you know. It's not like you can just make something new. You know, there's so many different things that are in consideration here. But basically, I believe that people will be choosing to live in places to meet each other, you know, for the community. But they may work in Sydney, you know, through the virtual reality. But the human need of culture, connecting, going out, you know, everything like that, food, right? That will continue because that's what makes us human. So I'm not pessimistic on cities. I think the boom of cities as the commercial center where everybody has to go, that is already clear before COVID, that it's declining. And technology will help us to work remotely, but to live remotely is difficult, you know, because we don't live through the camera. You know.
Okay, thank you. And next question is about collaboration and cooperation among workers in the future. And the question is the following. Are there successful examples of projects with the objective of innovation carried out by teams working at a distance? Does remote brainstorming have the same effectiveness? Which technology is needed? And in fact, most companies have created their success based on the culture, based on the fact that people living and working together and creating a strong community. What about that if the future of our work will be more remote?
Yes, well, you know, there are some things that work really well online and some things are terrible. Right? I mean, it's quite clear that, for example, if you know each other and you can collaborate already before, then moving online is not so difficult. So, for example, my wife's yoga class is online, right? They all know each other and they put on Zoom and they do the yoga together, right? But this only works because they already know each other. Right? And they can say, hey, you know, and it's better than nothing, right? And it's also paid, right? It's not free, right? But if you're trying to create a solution where the problem is fuzzy, and the problem is complicated, and the problem is subject to a lot of emotions, feelings, and design, and you know, then it's usually better to have a personal connection. Right? It's like online learning, same thing. Some things you can learn online, like if it's about things that are mostly logical. Right? let's keep in mind, that this is not an either-or scenario. I think many people, on the logical side, we can do many things like this, but humans aren't just logical. We're also receiving things in so many different ways. Right? So this is why I think we need both. Clearly, I think this new way of working is going to stay, just like Spotify went to the cloud and everybody has it, and we're still buying records, right? Vinyl records. So let's not be too black or white here, right? It's many answers in the future say it depends, right? Like, I think Americans are already moving all of their conferences and meetings online, and they actually paid events also. Europeans will take longer because of their cultural, Italians love to get together, and Spanish people also, and Brazilian people, right? Do they like it like the same in Finland? It's different, right? And so everybody comes with different prerequisites, and we have to keep this in mind when we think about the future.
Next question is about, quite a specific one, and is the following. Have you thought about promoting to the appropriate authorities the European immunity license?
You mean a medical immunity?
Yeah, I believe so, yes. And let me say European level, yes.
Well, this is a complicated topic. I'm not an expert on this, but Bill Gates has all the right things to say about this on YouTube. But basically, right now, we're just trying to get a therapeutic, which means that when you're sick, you can recover using medication. That's one thing, okay? Then we're trying to flatten the curve so that no more people get infected. And then we have a vaccine, which will take 12 to 18 months, right? So are we going to need a passport that says I have an antibody test? I think that's quite likely we're going to require, but then again, would it be any good? I mean, you can have an antibody test today, and then something happens tomorrow, and you're still not good to go, right? So I think there are lots of practical issues that are going to come in the way here. I personally see a period of up to 2 years where we have to adopt various measures of safety, security, monitoring, tracing, tracking, and all the combinations of this. Right? And that becomes kind of what we expect now. But let's not be too negative about this. We'll find new ways to do what we used to do in new ways, and they will also have their own value. Right? So yeah, a European immunity passport, that sounds good, but would we agree, right? This is the key question about Europe, right? But as I said earlier, I think now this situation is forcing us to agree, or the disagreement may blow it up.
We'll see. We still have 3 more questions, and we are reaching the end of the webinar. So, couple of questions first, and then I like the last one as, let me say, closing question. Next question is about, let me say, sustainability. In a global world, will the rebuilding of trust also shift from greater proximity, localness to sustainability, especially with regard to food? So what about, let me say, global, local sustainability in food?
Yes, well, sustainability has a lot to do with our economic paradigm, okay? Economic paradigm of traditional capitalism is jobs, growth, profit. That's it, right? GDP, right? And we clearly know this is not working because it leaves out all of the other aspects of what we want from sustainable economy, right? So in America, we have the corporate capitalism, right? It's all about corporate profits. In Europe, we have kind of a social capitalism, right? So it's more about the human part. And in China and other countries like that, we have state capitalism. Now, here's the question, if we want to live sustainable, what system is the best? Right? So I talked a lot about the last couple of years about what I call people, planet, purpose, and prosperity, the quadruple bottom line. Right? And Al Gore called this 10 years ago, sustainable capitalism. Right? So as long as we have companies who are only measured by economic progress, we will not have a sustainable world. right? Because how can you be sustainable when you only have one measurement, which is how quickly you make money, right? So then you invest your money in Aramco, the Saudi Arabian oil company. You don't invest it in renewable energy. You don't invest it in science, right? And now we can safely say with this crisis has been proven that the market in many ways has been dysfunctional, right, to address the problem. So the state had to come in and bail us out. And now the Italian state will have 10 billion euros debt because the system wasn't working, right? So we need to think about this future in a new way by saying, okay, we need to achieve four things, like people, planet, purpose, prosperity, not just one thing. And that's how we can become sustainable. So I think this question of being sustainable in 5 years, if you're not in a solid agenda that's moving on those 4 points, people will not do business with you. That you can already see that. This is already starting, especially now, people are saying, we don't want one emergency after the other, right? We want to create a world that's prepared.
Next question is really important, and let me say is in fact the last one, because the last one, the next one will be very simple but interesting. Next question is about education. Which kind of investment in education should be made for the new generations? What about, let me say, the future of education?
Well, let me go to my bar room and sit down on this now. So, well, it's really quite clear, okay? What we see right now is a return of science, right? If we leave America out there for a second, right? People really, now they realize that science is important, right? So that this is one thing that's happening, right? We also realize the return of humanity. So kindness, collaboration, forgiving, solidarity, compassion, right? And these are important things that you can't, they're not like a recipe or something, you know, they're not things that you learn at school. So what our kids have to learn is two things, right? Science and technology, that's definitely a clear winner, but you also have to be a good human, right? So music, ethics, art, understanding, philosophy, you know, because a lot of decisions in the future will not be done by logic. They will be done by saying, what do we want, right? What is human? For example, you know, would you want to live in a society that has guaranteed no virus, no diseases, but everybody is constantly tracked with the wristband so that the emperor would know what you're thinking, right? Or would get your temperature any time of the day automatically, like people have suggested in Israel and also in South Korea, right? So that's 100% security, no freedom. Right? So what our kids have to learn in school is they have to learn how to find the balance between technology and business and science and the human aspect. Right? So personally, I think that to be a human is something that we should teach our kids very early on, right? Imagination, creativity, design, innovation, entrepreneurship. Right? And this is, I think, the ticket to the future, because in 10 years, computers will do whatever we tell them with the voice command. You know, they will do all the hard work.
We have received a last-minute question that is interesting. If it were proved that the virus escaped from the lab of Wuhan, what would happen, in your point of view, for our next future?
Yeah, I don't give much credit to those theories of the lab of Wuhan. But, you know, suffice to say, I think every government is experimenting with all kinds of variations of these really terrible things. You know, probably not Italy and Switzerland, but pretty much everybody else is probably every major superpower. I think that's a question I really haven't thought about, because I really don't give much credit to that. I think that the situation is as it is. You know, years ago, I think Bill Gates went 6 years ago, there was somebody else like 10 years ago who said, this is coming, where I think it was Michio Kaku, the physicist, right? We have to be prepared. We have to have our stuff in place. We have to have the quick provisions in place. And as you can see, England and America weren't, for example. Italy, question mark, I don't know. But the more we are prepared, the better we can survive there. So I don't want to speculate on Wuhan, but I certainly hope that is a rumor.
So, first of all, Mr. Leonhard, thank you very much for all the time you've spent with us. for sharing your point of view about, let me say, the future and the great transformation that are coming and will come in the next future, and also for, let me say, answering the huge amount of questions received. I kindly ask all participants to fill the feedback form that you find top left on the platform. And before closing, just a final, very simple and straightforward question to you, Mr. Leonhard. You mentioned that you read 4 to 5 books, let me say, per month. And the next question is, by the way, which books would you suggest to people willing to think and reflect about the future, in addition to yours, obviously?
Okay, well, the first book you should read is Alvin Toffler, Future Shock, which is an old book, but a goldie, right? And it's basically like the gold standard. The one I've been reading lately is Stuart Russell, who is the professor of AI at UC Berkeley. It's called Human Compatible. It's talking about how machines and AI can work with humans in the future. And then there's a really great one by Christina Figueira, the UN climate change person. It's about climate change. I forgot the title. This is what happens when you read stuff on the Kindle, right? You read, but you don't see the title. So just look for Christina Figueira's. I think it's called The World We Want or something like this. Those are the 3 books. A very positive outlook on how climate change, global warming, fighting that becomes a real business, which I agree with, right? And so, I mean, I can publish the list that I'm currently reading. It's a very long list because I tend to read more like, a little bit here, a little bit there.
Yes. If you can send us, let me say, a greater list, we will publish it on our website to the participants so that they can for sure get some food for thought. Thank you very much again, and we look forward to meeting you in person, let me say, in the next future.
Stay well, stay safe.